All
do
right.
it.
Cool. Omar, take us out, man.
Welcome back, everybody. I know a lot of you are joining us for this second call of our series. We're going to be doing this just as a reminder every other Thursday. So, not next Thursday, the following, there will be another one of these calls, and we're trying to bring as much value to you as we possibly can. I'm Omar Subi. I'm the director of sales for Align. And today we have Jeff Bonk here with us, who will introduce himself in just a moment. And Jeff Kiss, who's our managing broker in New Jersey, has taken some time to spend with us this afternoon. And I'll let you two introduce yourselves.
Awesome. Thanks, Omar. Thank you guys for being here at mid-August. I mean, anyone here working through this with us right now, it really shows a lot of who you are and what kind of business you're going to run and what kind of person you are and what kind of business you've put together already. So congratulations, everyone, for just being here and taking this seriously and really elevating the industry, which is what we're here for, right? We're here. We want to bring the industry together. We want to help everyone who wants to elevate, stay informed, strategize, really get on top of building a business that's going to be super strong on the other side of all these changes than it was before. My name is Jeff Bonk. I am the team leader of the HBB group and also a partner with Brett and Omar and Jen on here at Align, regional director, growth partner, all the fun things that we're doing here. And with eXp Realty. And I'm really proud to say we're with eXp Realty today, especially with Jeff Kiss joining us, which we're really appreciative of. Jeff has been, I mean, look, this isn't a brokerage thing at all, but you guys have been out front, Jeff, and we appreciate you guys from like jump with the meetings, the trainings, the paperwork. And we thought we'd bring, you into the conversation this week. You have such a broad view over the entire state, the way we're set up, where you kind of see the view into so many agents and so many circumstances and situations that we would love to have you kind of give some perspective and answer some questions that you've been so, nice to do for us today. And just like I heard something the other day that was leadership was taking a stance, right, and doing it proactively before like everybody else files in behind. And I think that's really what you and the leadership of EXP has done. We appreciate that. So, Brett, I don't know if you want to say a few words to kick us off, or we'll get over to Jeff and we'll start kind of round robin here.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in where I'm still seeing it. So we're in a lot of masterminds nationwide. And I think that, one important piece to the puzzle is Leo, who's EXP CEO, has been mentioning a lot of things and very vocal throughout this process on, how they're receiving the information from NAR and from the DOJ and whatnot in the settlement. And New Jersey made the decision to flip the switch August 1st. So a lot of folks are now in that scramble that New Jersey had to go through the week of August 1st, which I was calling Y2K because we didn't know what was going to happen when everything flipped on. So I wanted to use this Zoom as an opportunity to not only talk about experiences that we've had, because we have folks on here from kind of all over the US listening in, but also to keep in mind that with the NAR lawsuit and the settlement, that is a nationwide thing. So although there may or may not be state specifics, and I'll let Jeffrey get into more of that, a lot of the way that we're operating in this, post August 1st way is a lot of the way that it seems, based on a Zoom Omar was on this morning with Leo and whatnot, that other brokerages are following suit, and that EXP seemed to have really hit the nail on the head when it came through this, and that they are interpreting the settlement in a way that not only protects the consumer, but also protects the agents on a state level. And just have, like, Jeffrey, all of you guys have just been incredible throughout the process. The amount of questions that have come to me have come to Jeff and Omar, and we've just been asking, and you're giving answers, and we're moving towards, we're doing business in that way that is 100% compliant. And it's actually not, there's no issue. It's just that this is how we do it. And then we sell a bunch of homes or we do a bunch of rentals, and it's all fine. We're on the other end of it. So, Jeffrey, if you don't mind introducing yourself a little bit too, really appreciate you having you on this and being outwardly facing for EXP here in New Jersey.
Well, thanks, and thanks for the invitation. I am Jeffrey Kist. I'm my fancy title at eXp Realty is the designated managing broker in New Jersey. I'm the broker of record, which is basically what that means, but I lead the broker team and the staff that we have in New Jersey. And as was mentioned, I oversee the entire state of New Jersey. So We have agents from tip to tip, and it's a lot of work. And yes, there are a lot of challenges, but I'm going on my 8th year here, and there was a structure we put in place there that kind of allowed us to grow into that and be able to effectively manage an organization like this. So I'm very proud of Leo as our CEO, and Holly Mabry, who is our senior vice president of brokerage operations, who have really kind of led that for us company wide and allowed our jobs to be a little bit easier. And so for New Jersey, yeah, we flipped the switch on August 1st. That was a state decision. Just to be clear, that wasn't our decision. But the best part of it is that it encompasses most, if not all, of everything in that settlement that's going to start on Saturday. So we've already had a lot of time to practice here. And Brett, as you said, it's simply making, just changing the way we do things, but doing what we do best, which is help consumers buy, sell, and lease real estate.
That's awesome, Jeffrey. I like to say we had the settlement. It got pushed back once. It got pushed back again. We thought it was going to get pushed back again, but then all of a sudden it got accelerated 2 weeks, and it was like, boom, it's happening now. So It was quite the fun timeline to deal with. And like you said, none of us in this room made the decision to do that. It was, we're just playing with the cards that are dealt to us. Jeffrey, if you would take us for the first 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks, I get on 2 weeks to the day. What are some things you're seeing at a high level that you think could be helpful for people to understand, common trends, common threads, maybe some common misconceptions that people seem to keep coming to you with, and just kind of give some perspective of the landscape, because we all have experiences with a few other agents, a few other clients, but I think your perspective from such a high level really does offer a lot of benefit. So if that's something you wouldn't mind starting us off with, I think we make sure this phone stops ringing. I'll be right back.
Sure. So, I mean, the biggest thing we're seeing is confusion, and it's confusion really outside of our company, because we've been training on this for months. And so we've been prepared for it. We've prepared our agents for it. And there's just been a lot of confusion, though, with other brokerages who have not prepared for this. One of the biggest things I've seen is, just an understanding or a misunderstanding of the different terms that we even have in real estate. For example, the difference between cooperation versus compensation. Cooperation means we will work together as various brokers. Compensation means the listing broker might be compensating the buyer's broker. So eXp Realty as a brokerage kind of led the charge and the decision to say we're not participating in broker to broker compensation. Well, that kind of spread around to other brokerages simply because we're very good at social media and publicly announcing things. But that spread around to other brokerages, and that message translated to eXp Realty is no longer going to work with other brokerages. We're not cooperating with other brokerages. So it's important to understand the terms of our industry. One of the terms, at least that my agents will know, whenever I hear the term off-market listing, that just sends shivers down my spine, because there's no such thing as an off-market listing. And I'll be glad to explain that if anybody wants to know. But it's just more about confusion. One of the things that recently, I was actually yesterday, Leo, our CEO, participated in a multi-brokerage forum facilitated by Riz Media. And as part of that conversation, the underlying message is we're really not changing as much as you think we are, right? It's really, things aren't changing as much as far as compensation is concerned. It's just more about changing how we're saying it. So one of the things that we all won't be doing moving forward, we can, but the guidance from the Department of Justice is not to participate in broker to broker compensation, meaning we should not be paying each other, right? So instead, when we're working with a seller, we negotiate a listing fee with that seller. Whatever that fee is, that's what the seller is going to pay for our services. The seller can then and should be open to sharing compensation, or not even sharing. It's the wrong word to use. And see, I made that mistake myself. It's about offering compensation to a buyer's broker, right? And that's all going to be different. Those rates are going to be different. And so each buyer is going to have a different agreement with a buyer broker. So one of the things that we're encouraging is not to have a seller set a specific amount. I'm offering this, right? Instead, look at the contract, look at what's in there as a term of the contract, right? It's just going to be a term of the contract. Have a general idea, but it's going to be a term of the contract and something that the seller can now evaluate, which I think is going to be very good. But it's more about confusion, and that's really what we're seeing, Jeff. We're seeing a lot of confusion.
Jeffrey, sorry, just on that note too. Now, one thing that people have been saying is that, well, like EXP agents are not allowed, their sellers are not allowed to offer 2.5% out to buyer comp. And based on that, it seems like as a whole, we're more so being open to the idea of, flexible compensation based on the terms and what is best for the seller and what's going to, be the best net amount for them or the strongest deal with terms or what have you. But if the seller wanted to, it was adamant, let's say a builder wants to pay out 3% to buyer's agents, and we have the listing, is that something that they're still allowed to do?
So I'm going to preface this by saying it would be in everybody's best interest not to discuss specific compensation amounts, especially if we're in a multi-brokerage conversation here. We don't want to get into any other antitrust kind of things, but to kind of speak generally, if a seller wants to offer a specific number as compensation and they direct us to offer that number, then absolutely we can do that. That is a lawful instruction of the seller. We cannot say no to that. Our work as a professional, in this industry is to give our best advice and guidance to a seller, right? So our best advice and guidance to a seller is to say, yes, be open to compensating, but not putting out there a specific amount. Here's an example why. If a seller, is offering a higher amount than what a buyer broker's agreement is, as I hope we all know, and as far as the buyer broker agreements are concerned, buyer agents can't be compensated more than is in the agreement with the buyer. Okay, so whatever that number is, we can't be paid more than that. And that's before showing the property. Now, what we all should do, in my opinion, is, reach out to the listing agent and say, is the seller offering compensation, to a buyer's broker? Yes or no? Yes. Is there amount that they have set for that? If the answer is yes, great. We have that amount, so this way we can prepare the buyer. And the buyer can then know, is the amount going to cover what the agreement was, or is there still money that they're going to have to bring to the table? The other reason is if the amount is if the amount is more than what the buyer and the buyer agent have agreed to, before showing the property, it is technically possible to amend the buyer broker agreement to increase the compensation to match whatever that seller is offering. So then as a result, as a listing agent, by the seller putting out that number, it's just costs them money, right? Because now they're going to end up paying more than that buyer agreement was, right? Now, it's still possible for that extra money to be used. So if it was only for the lower amount and there was still a remainder there, that money can either go back to the seller, or the buyer can use that as not use it, but request from the seller that amount be given as a concession to them. So a lot of different scenarios here, but most important thing is to give the best advice to the client. And the best advice is just be open to the offer versus putting out there a specific amount.
So Jeff, I mean, the conversation should be pretty simple with the sellers if you're sitting down with them, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, do you care about your net? Sure. Is your biggest priority to net the highest amount of money possible? The answer is most likely going to be yes. So what we've done with our organization is we've told seller that we're going to advertise that seller will entertain any and all requests. Please put in your offer. Is that what you're suggesting in these scenarios? Because personally, I've used that with my sellers in the last 2 weeks, and the response has been nothing but great. They've loved that idea because when I sit down with them, I'm explaining the entire process that the highest amount of money that they're going to net, which should be your goal if you're representing the seller, right? Can be possible with or without compensation. Because you might get someone that says, okay, I'm going to cover my buyer broker compensation myself. Or you might get someone that says, I'm requesting whatever, 4%, but they net them the most amount of money. Is that what you're saying here? Just to clarify for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. The seller, obviously is going to go for most of the time. There are other circumstances where they may not, but they will most of the time go for the highest net. One of the things to keep in mind is that if you've seen the New Jersey Realtors Buyer Agency Agreement, which, we're encouraging that we don't use that. We have our own buyer broker agreement for that. It's 5 pages long. It's very small print, and it's a lot of terms to go through. But in there is the option for a buyer to direct the buyer's broker not to show listings that are not where the seller is not offering compensation. So, the seller should be aware of that by not being open to that, they could limit their buyer pool as a result. So it is important that the seller know all of the options that they have available.
That's an extremely important piece that I was unaware of until this moment when you just said that can actually be kind of filtered through, for lack of a better word, by direction of the buyer. Right. And the way I've been kind of talking about everything that you were saying too, Jeffrey, was like, this is just another strategic tool now, rather than being something that was not discussed. So now, like, the advice right now, and I completely agree with you in today's current market, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, right now, the approach should be, let's be open to concessions, but let's not lock ourselves into a number. Now, if the market softens and there's 10 people all lined up, the same exact property that can't sell for 60 or 90 days, my advice might change to be like, hey, there might be a reason to incentivize with X number of concession dollars being proactively told if inquired, right? And how we can communicate that's something I'd like to get into in a little bit later too, just to make sure. I know that's like a little bit of an ambiguous place of how to communicate that. We have very specific rules, but then there's some gap. And then there might be other times where the market's so incredibly strong and we see this weird flip of the market where all these, buyers are paying their agents directly. We might advise, like, don't be open to pay. Like, so it is right now, there's, I think, very, a good consensus over the way that we should continue to operate to let the market still flow. And a lot of people are still operating the same way. But I think it's important to know that there's movement here based on where the industry goes, where the market goes. And I love that you pointed out kind of playing both sides of this thing, because I've been saying this as well, where from the fiduciary responsibility, our advice to sellers should be one thing, what we just talked about. But from the other side, when we're in a fiduciary responsibility to our buyer, we should be 100% calling up the other side and hoping that listing agent is going to give us a number so we could be in fiduciary and give as much information as we can to our buyers, even though we wouldn't have done that. It's just like negotiating. This is Omar and I were talking earlier. Like, skills. We're going to have to negotiate now, and our skills are going to have to become way better. And that value that we bring to the buyers and sellers that we're working with are going to be, incredibly more tangible now with this, new environment that we're navigating.
Yeah, and buyers, buyers agents now have to. I mean, buyers agents should have always done this, and I, for those of you who have been with us long enough, that I've always been a proponent of buyer broker agreements, buyer agency agreements. Always. It may not have been required. It hadn't been required by law until now, but I've always been, because you're establishing that relationship, you're showing your value, right? And you're making that relationship with the buyer. so that they're not going off and going to different and clicking on websites, and you're creating that loyalty. And the biggest pushback I used to get was, buyers don't want to sign this. They don't want to be locked into an agreement. Well, then why do you want to work with them? So if they're not going to be loyal to you, why are you spending all the effort to be loyal to them when they can just simply walk away?
And I'll say my excuse for that always was, well, there's 5 other good agents in my market that aren't requiring people to sell it, to sign those. So it puts me at a strategic disadvantage. The playing field
good news
was just leveled, right? So now
the good news is that we all have to do it now, right? Yep. So that's no longer a disadvantage.
Absolutely. No, that's where I was excited about this when that happened, and people thought I was a little crazy because I was like, I always wanted to do buyer agency, but I really couldn't. If I wanted to have any chance of really operating well in our small micro market, I would have gotten blown out. So I agree with that fully. So I want to open it up. Any other questions on this topic? I have a couple other topics that we wanted to hit, but we just
regarding the off market. I feel like it's the process. I mean, even before this was very convoluted about like what you needed to sign, what you can do. I almost feel like it's like not even worth having any paperwork for those if you're going to do them, just to like make sure you do it right from the beginning until you get a deal. But what details do we have to keep in mind?
Anybody else see me shiver?
Yep.
I
take it easy, man.
I shivered when you said there's no such thing as off market. So I was like,
well, so let me
clarify that for you, because we went through this a couple of days ago. It's off MLS, not an off market. Is right. The term.
Okay,
there's a big difference. So an off there can't a property can't be both off market and a listing at the same time. Okay. An off market property is when you're working for the buyer and you're going and knocking on doors of houses that are not available for sale. And you're saying, I have a buyer who wants to purchase your house. Do you want to sell? Right? If the answer is yes, they become a FSBO. You are a buyer's agent. That is an off market property, right? An off MLS property is more of an office exclusive. Okay. Anytime you are going in search of a buyer for a property, there must be a listing agreement. So if you meet a for sale by owner, if you meet somebody that says, oh, well, I'd be interested in selling, but I don't really want to list, bring me a buyer. We cannot, nobody can go and advertise that property in search of a buyer for the purpose of selling that property. There has to be a listing agreement. There has to be. And that's always been the case, by the way. That's not new, right?
And in the case, Jeff, if you have, so like they're hiring you as like with like the broker waiver non-cooperation, right? They want to hire you exclusively. They don't want you to put on the MLS. So it's like you said, off MLS or like pocket listing.
Office exclusive.
Still not allowed to. Are we allowed to market that or no? Because I was told that the office exclusive, we can't market it.
In most markets, you cannot because of the NAR clear cooperation policy.
Even with a broker waiver?
Even with a waiver of broker cooperation, you cannot. There are few markets where you can do that, but the NAR clear cooperation policy does not allow properties to be publicly marketed if they're not in the MLS.
And so when you say publicly market, like, can I call a buyer about it? I can't post it on Instagram or put a sign, but can I call a buyer and say, hey, I got this deal? Or is that
a listing. So if you have an office exclusive listing,
yes,
you can reach out to buyers you're working with who specifically meet the criteria of that property. You cannot send a mass email to a buyer list. Or to other agents, or you can't go in search. That's considered public marketing, right? Posting it in a Facebook group or something like that. Can't do that either. Any form of advertising, we can't do it, but we can go to the buyers we're working with and say, and the ones who specifically meet that criteria, and say, I have this office exclusive listing that meets what you're looking for.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And to be clear, that's New Jersey conversation, and it might be check with your state broker or whoever you're governed under, if you're not with EXP, just to confirm wherever you may be what that answer should be as well.
And I'll make the general statement that this applies mostly across the country in most markets.
So if we have a list of like 500 investors that we work with
Mhm.
that buy anything from $200,000 condos, $2 million multifamilies, and we say, hey, we have a office exclusive.
Mhm.
This is the property. Is that possible to send to that group?
If they are a potential buyer for that property, yes. So in that example, the technical answer is yes, because as long as every single one of those buyers has indicated that they would purchase a property like that.
So most investors are that person, though. They're
Okay.
they're open to, if the deal is right, if it's a quote unquote good deal, they're open to things like that. So you would be okay with that?
I would, well, it's not necessarily whether I'm okay with it or
No,
not.
I know.
It's the rules we all have to follow. So, my answer has to be, as long as the people you are sending it to have indicated that they would purchase a property like that, it would be perfectly fine. If you're sending it to a general investor list that says this might interest you, that could be considered a different story.
Jeff,
You see the difference?
Joel, go ahead. You were trying to ask a question before.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question about the buyer agreement. So I came from a state where majority of agents got buyer agency agreements, and moved to a state where nobody has gotten them. So it's a whole different ballgame here. But we used to be able to put in to protect ourselves as buyer's agents, like whatever they were offering, or like whatever, 2.5% or per MLS, which of course we can't do anymore because it's not in the MLS. Do you have any suggestions about what you can put in to protect yourself so that you're not losing money if a buyer is offering 3 versus 2.5, besides changing it as you go forward?
So I'm just going to make the statement again about numbers. So just be careful, please, not to share specific compensation numbers. But one of the things we have to remember is that anything we used to do is the old way, right? And so the old way doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. So we'll just wave bye-bye to the old way. So now there is no way to kind of protect yourself in that regard. Now it's going to be about establishing what the fee is for your service, right? And that's what you're going to be putting in that agreement. If the seller is willing to cover some or all of that, fantastic. If the seller is not, the buyer needs to be prepared to pay that fee, right? So it's really going to be about you deciding, well, and again, if there are multiple brokerages here, you have to take the direction from your broker. At eXp Realty, we allow for the individual agent to determine their fee to a term based on the value that they're offering. Okay, so it's really going to just be about establishing what that fee is.
And as far as bonuses go, let's say somebody offers a bonus, can we put in there somewhere any bonuses offered go to the buyer's agent?
You cannot do that. The rules say that it must be exact. So we can't use phrases like up to or no more than or plus any bonuses. It has to be a specific number. Or it can also be a number based on circumstances, but it has to be specific.
So this is going to be a constant renegotiation with your buyers.
Well, that depends, because the agreement has to be in place before you show the property. So again, if you contact a listing agent and the listing agent gives you information which suggests that the compensation will be higher than what you have an agreement with the buyer, as long as you haven't shown that property yet or submitted an offer for that property, you can amend the agreement. You can revise it, but just keep in mind that's now the agreement going forward, unless it gets amended again. I mean, it sounds like a paperwork nightmare to me to amend the agreement before you show any property, especially if you're showing 10 properties, you know,
course.
but you know, we can only have one agreement and one compensation.
And you may have answered this, Jeff, I apologize, but with the listing, right? Say I take 5%
Don't
and
use numbers.
okay, sorry. Say I take a commission amount.
Uh-huh.
After that listing goes live, I can partake and give some of that commission away, or no?
If you're an eXp Realty agent, you may not.
Okay, so whatever it is whatever commission that they agree to pay me can only be paid to me. And even like that additional comment box that they have there, if we put it in there, like language specifying what they're willing to pay the other agent, that like, would that be kosher or no?
It is okay to do that. It would be best if we don't do that, right? So the idea is to have the seller be open to the idea of, open to compensating a buyer's broker without setting a specific number. Because once it goes in the agreement, then that's a specific number. There are also MLSs, at least in New Jersey, some MLSs which require listing agreements to be provided to them with the listing. Some have specifically said, we don't want to see any agreements that have buyer broker compensation on it, right? So the new norm now is determining what your fee is to list the property, to be a listing agent, and then the seller can offer whatever compensation they want. They should evaluate it on a case-by-case basis based on the terms of the contract.
So
because
Jeff,
again, just putting out a blanket number, I mean, the offers could be terrible, right? And so, but they're stuck because they've already offered that number.
Mhm.
Jeff, so when you're going on a listing presentation, you're negotiating your commission as a listing agent,
right?
Plus what it would be if you get an unrepresented buyer. Can you explain to everyone what an unrepresented buyer is and where everyone should draw the line of their services to an unrepresented buyer? Because that's
Sure.
the question that I've been hearing quite a bit on.
So an unrepresented buyer is almost like working with a FSBO, right? So we're the listing agent and a buyer calls us as the listing agent and says, I'm interested in the property. I don't want representation. And I'm not going to have an agent and I don't want you as an agent. So in the listing agreement that eXp Realty created, there is a section in there for unrepresented buyer. So it's an additional fee that the seller can pay for the tasks that are needed to assist the buyer to help the seller facilitate the sale. So what that means is someone's going to have to attend the home inspection. Well, that's going to be your time to do that, right? Someone's going to have to attend the appraisal. That's going to be your time to do that. So there are things you're going to have to do to help the buyer for the benefit of the seller. So on our listing agreement, that additional box, it's not what the additional amount will be for compensation for an unrepresented buyer. It would be the total that would be paid if there is also an unrepresented buyer.
And you just have to put a total in there for whatever your work is going to be, and you're just sort of guessing at how much time it's going to cost you and what you want to charge for that time.
That is correct. And again, it has to be agreed to by the seller.
Jeffrey.
You mentioned the office exclusive or the broker exclusive. So since we're all EXP out of Montclair, we can market it to everybody in this state with EXP, correct?
Yeah. Anybody who is licensed with eXp Realty in New Jersey, regardless of where you are in New Jersey, it is considered an office exclusive because everything falls under my license. So it can be, and we have our workplace groups to do that in, right? We also have our eXp exclusives system that we can use as well, which will have that info in there too. Just a note about that eXp exclusive system, just please make sure there is a listing agreement in place before putting that in there. It's really important.
Jeffrey, if we can go back to the unrepresented buyers for 1 second, because I've been getting a lot of questions of where's the fiduciary line drawn? And like an example of this would be unrepresented buyer comes in, doesn't want representation. You talk through the CIS, we're clear. I want to make an offer. Can you put together the contract for me? I want to know how this is priced. Can you send me comps? Like, I want to know, is the seller wanting a quick close or do they want to rent it back? I want to, all these little things that to another buyer's agent, we would give that information to help the seller get the right deal. But it feels kind of like maybe it's a blurred line with an unrepresented buyer.
So
how do you interpret that?
More than interpret, I'll give you the fact.
Even better.
The seller, when we're representing the seller only, we are a seller's agent. Our fiduciary duties are with the seller. We cannot give any advice whatsoever to the buyer. Okay, none whatsoever. Now, our company and maybe others have said in the case of an unrepresented buyer, it's usually best to have the buyer's attorney prepare the sales contract. In New Jersey, if that happens, there is no attorney review period, right? So all of the negotiation for the contract has to be done before it gets signed, right? So in that case, we can simply act, as a vessel in essence. Tell us what your price is, tell us what the terms are. You know what? Here's the contract. Fill it in, right? And then sign it. Okay. But we cannot give the buyer any advice whatsoever. We cannot give them comps. If the seller says, remember, everything that the seller has told us is confidential. So unless the seller has given us permission to say, I want a closing date by this, or I've got to move out, or I've got to get to the country, the other side of the country by this time, that's information we can never share with a buyer. And by the way, even if we represent them as a dual agent, we could never share that information with a buyer.
Unless the seller tells us to.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And so the preference there gives written permission.
Okay. Because that's where the fiduciary lines kind of blur to me a little bit, where it's giving information to the unrepresented buyer that is going to benefit the seller that I represent, getting the best deal, getting the terms they want, even to the, this is something that's come up. That's why I'm staying here for a second, where if the seller says, hey, show them how we got to this price, send them those comps.
Then we can do that.
Okay, cool. So as long as
if the seller, it would be inappropriate for us to ask the seller to do that. But if the seller says, share the comps with them, right? Then that's perfectly fine to do. The most important piece is to remember that we were in this circumstance, we have fiduciary duties and represent the seller only. So no advice at all. We could negotiate, for the seller with the buyer directly, right?
Right.
They're unrepresented. So they want to put this price. If the seller is expecting more and wants you to negotiate, well, then negotiate higher, right? They chose to be unrepresented.
And that's where I think a little bit of that, making sure that we're still acting in a fiduciary for the seller by facilitating it properly. Because I've heard a lot of people, not in this room, but around the country, different, Instagram posts. Oh, if you're unrepresented, I'm not talking to you. And that feels like you're doing your seller a disservice and not being a fiduciary to get them the deal, because now you're being, very, adamant and hard up against the buyer. So there's a nuance there of helping them facilitate while remaining in fiduciary 100% with the seller.
So is there no technical dual agency anymore with this, or is this the dual agency, the unrepresented buyer?
No, so there's still dual agency. One of the common misconceptions is that all parties in a transaction have to be represented, which they don't. Okay. There's common misconception is if the buyer calls on a property, we are automatically representing them. Well, that's never been the case. But however someone was trained, it may have just been how they were trained. But A buyer doesn't automatically get representation. A buyer, we either have to offer it and the buyer has to accept it, or the buyer has to request it and we have to accept it. And that's always been the case.
So if a buyer comes in and that, like in this scenario we're talking about, but wants representation, right? In order for us to double end, again, no numbers, we would have to get a completely separate agreement signed with them. And then that unrepresented buyer fee would be that's not what we're going with.
That's correct. That's right. So then you're a dual agent, you're representing both the seller and the buyer. You have to have a buyer's agreement with the buyer. And then, you know, again, if the buyer's paying the fee, great. If not, and they want the seller to, it gets written in the offer.
And can we decide not to represent the buyer and just say, hey, we'll take the unrepresented buyer fee. That way we just keep the fiduciary to the seller and not play that game?
You can, but if the buyer wants representation, they'll go somewhere else.
So if the buyer does want representation and it's a dual agency situation, the first step we have to make is go to the seller and see if that's okay, right? Before we can act on both sides.
Yes. However, you should already have that consent, because as part of the listing paperwork, there should be the informed consent to dual agency signed. And also, now that designated agency is a new option, you know, that should also be signed at the time of the listing, just in case that option comes up. But you would have already had that consent.
All right, and I guess just to, protect ourselves, I guess it would probably be advantageous just to have that conversation again. Like, this buyer wants to work with me. This is the relationship. Are you okay with that? Before.
I don't think that's necessary. I mean, that's, in my opinion, that's the equivalent of giving, you know, a seller or a consumer a commission rate and saying, how do you feel about that? Right? It's just, you know, this is the fee we charge. If they want to negotiate it, fine. If they don't, that's the fee we charge. We get the consent to dual agency. We don't have to come back later and say, I know you signed this already, but how do you feel about it? Right? It's not necessary.
So the seller too, can they deny dual agency at the listing appointment and go on as okay?
They can, and that used to be a problem, because if they decline dual agency, it meant that nobody in that brokerage could represent the buyer. Now with designated agency, it's not a problem. It just means you can't represent the buyer.
Thanks.
Hey, Jeffrey, so as we have a stance kind of as an organization, and I know, like, you know, Brett, Omar, and I have discussed like our guidance to all our agents as well, which is aligns with yours with, you know, don't lock yourself into a number. Is there any guidance on this, on dual agency and guiding sellers at the listing appointment to either be open to it or not be open to it? Because it feels like dual agency to me feels like a slippery slope that I've heard rumors that it might go away in the future, that it's illegal in other states, I believe, already. Like, should we be saying, hey, we think for your best interest, you should actually want us to just operate as a seller's agent? We do have this designated agent option or unrepresented buyer, but like, does EXP have a position? Do you think we should create one to protect ourselves on that front?
eXp Realty does not have a position on that, simply because we're a global brokerage, right? And so there are different agency rules in different states. Don't quote me on this, but if someone's here from Florida, they could answer this. I don't believe dual agency is permitted in Florida, and they have to act as a transaction broker, if I remember correctly. That could have changed, but that was the last that I heard. So agency rules are different. You know, dual agency is nothing more than a legal conflict of interest. That's what it is. But it has to, you know, nothing about dual agency has changed. So we are required to explain to a seller and a buyer and a landlord and a tenant, we're required to explain to them that we're still providing you with fiduciary duties, but now they become limited, because I can't give you advice that's going to give you an advantage over the other party. right? And so it could go away. Actually, I thought dual agency was going to go away August 1st, but instead the law introduced designated agency as a new option, which I found interesting. So dual agency is still here. Dual agency is going to be here for a while. So we just have to do what we've always done, is explain what dual agency is. And when working in teams specifically, it is likely the best option anyway, simply because there's often more than one team member involved in a transaction. So dual agency will likely be the best option over designated agency anyway.
Can you go a little deeper on that? Because I was kind of thinking designated agency might be the better direction to go. So I'm interested to hear that.
For an individual agent, yes. For a team, not necessarily, because as we understand designated agency, it is one agent being appointed. So if I just give an example of a team, it usually includes at least the team leader and a team member. Well, those are two, right? And so if designated agency only allows one agent, that means that either the team leader or the team member has to be working for the client. It can't be both. So that's why, as a seller's agent, it would make sense for both agents to work on that, right? In the case of dual agency, you've got if you've got both sides of the transaction in the same team, well, there's going to be a lot of involvement with different people. Again, with the team leader is going to be on both sides of the transaction. Well, in designated agency, that's not possible. So that's where, at least as we understand it right now. So that means that the team members would be the only ones representing. It means other team members could not assist with showings, with open houses, with home inspections. It would have to be only that agent performing the duties.
Gotcha.
Is
Okay.
there any chance that EXP decides to withdraw from being part of NAR and saying, screw all these rules, we're gonna do our own thing?
Good question, and one that's been asked before. So I think it's important to recognize a few things. Number one, much of what we're talking about right now is state law and applies to every brokerage in New Jersey, for the most part. What we're talking about applies to every brokerage in New Jersey, whether they're an NAR member or not. Okay, that's first thing. Second thing is the Realtor Association is a powerful association. And I don't think it would be in any brokerage's best interest not to be a part of it. So at this time, the official company position is that we are NAR members and will remain NAR members at this time.
But we don't have to pay their dues, right? If we don't, I think that's elective.
It's
I
not
thought they-
elective. If you are part of a brokerage that's a Realtor member, you do have to pay Realtor member dues.
I wish we could.
I think we're supposed to call it a realtor based on the commercials that I've seen. We're realtors.
That's awful.
I want
That's
to
just
start
as bad
kind of
as realtor.
Yeah, that's actually realtor.
Yeah.
I want to start kind of moving through too and touching on like anything that's come up in the chat. So I know like Mark Stein, if you want to unmute yourself and come up, I know we can't talk percentages, and let us know if that's been answered yet with what Mr. Bonk took a deep dive into the upper unrepresented buyer.
Yes, it was made clear on this more than in the past. Just want to make sure we're filling out the paperwork correctly when it comes to listings and unrepresented buyers, but we got it done.
Excellent. And Jamie Kiefer has, is the buyer agency agreement doc going to be a required doc by EXP in order to close out a transaction, even if the compensation is coming from the seller's side?
Yes, that's both state law and NAR settlement. We have to have a buyer broker agreement.
That's doesn't matter which brokerage you're at or anything. That is
does not matter.
Correct. Okay, perfect. Further stage.
And by the way, on that point, if you are working with a buyer now, and even with the tenant now, but even if the buyer is under contract, you still need a buyer broker agreement in place. So please make sure you get that signed.
Jen Schiff
Hey,
was asking
Jeffrey. Sorry, Brett. Can I jump in really quickly?
Yeah, go for it.
Jeffrey, are you able to speak to a couple things in Maryland or no?
Unfortunately not. I'm not licensed there.
No worries. That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah,
Guys, I have
and
a question about obviously the like MLS fees are obviously those are going away, right? But like across the country, the admin fees were always very popular, and I don't think that they were something that we ever really did. Could you explain how that could be applied?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing to note, and I just want to mention to Romeo that, there are things regarding the NAR settlement I can answer, just not Maryland state law. So if you have questions around that, feel free to ask. So when it comes to the New Jersey law anyway, all compensation, any fees, anything that's charged to a client has to go through the brokerage, right? So that's all considered compensation. A client cannot compensate you directly. Okay. So the MLS fees and admin fees and all these other things, these were commonly charged by listing brokers to buyer brokers, right? So it could be this minus this, right? Well, that would be with the share of compensation, right? So if we're sharing compensation, when the seller is the one compensating, there's no fees to charge, right? And so the listing agents now need to make sure any fees that they need to pay or want to collect, to make sure that they're collecting them from the seller, right? Also keep in mind that admins and things like that are not paid by the seller. So it can't be a separate invoice for admin or TC work paid by the seller, because they didn't actually hire them to do that, right? In New Jersey, if you are licensed as an agent or as a salesperson, any compensation you receive must be done through the brokerage. So you could be, your entire work could be the admin for an agent, right? Your entire work could be an admin for an agent, but the agent can't pay you as an employee or as an independent contractor, can't pay you directly. It has to be paid through compensation through the brokerage. Unlicensed admins can be paid by the agent directly. That's not an issue. The licensed admin also has to be with the same brokerage. And EXP has a different policy on that, which is fine and is applicable in other states, where if you're part of our referral division, you can be an admin for a realty agent. Unfortunately, New Jersey law doesn't allow that, because it means you're working for two different brokers, which they don't allow. So we're going to still see some of those MLS fees being charged, simply because there were listings that were taken prior to all of these changes, and there was offers of compensation shared. So we're still going to see some of that, but most of that we really should see go away, because just even logically, it does not make sense for a seller to charge some kind of admin fee to a buyer's broker. It doesn't make any sense.
Jeff, we have a question from Jen Schiff. Can you further explain not being able to handle services on someone's listing as an agent on a team?
Can I further explain? Yes. So that's only if it's designated agency. So designated agency means that you are the only agent in the brokerage representing that client. It's me and you. That's it. Any other agent, let me just pick Omar and Jeff. Omar is representing the seller, Jeff is representing the buyer. If Omar is, the designated agent for the seller and Jeff is the designated agent for the buyer, Only they can work with those clients, right? They can also negotiate against each other because they're now providing full fiduciary responsibilities for that client. So if, Jeff can't make a home inspection with the buyer, if he's a designated agent, he can't ask anybody else to do it. Only he can do it, which is why keeping some of the original agency, seller, buyer, and dual is going to be important for teams.
Okay, so I just want to make sure, how does one get to a designated agency agreement? Is this a different type of agreement than the typical buyer and seller agreements that most of us are going to be executing? I just want to be very clear.
It's an additional consent. So in the same way we have informed consent to dual agency, there is now a new informed consent to designated agency.
So if we sign a standard listing agreement with the seller, is it still okay for an agent on the team to hold an open house or to support showings or anything along those lines? I just want to, okay.
Yes, because, and the reason for that is because the consent to dual agency and the consent to designated agency at the time of the listing is giving consent if the opportunity arises, right? So at that point, as far as agency is concerned, we are a seller's agent, and seller's agent is blanket agency in New Jersey, which means that everyone at eXp Realty in New Jersey represents that seller, even if you're the only one working with them.
Okay, I have one more Gen Shift question that's not in the chat.
Okay.
So you mentioned how now when the seller is paying our compensation, that a seller can't pay a transaction company invoice, or what if there were like construction invoices that are being paid at settlement or different things like that. So now that you're saying that's the case, what happens to those invoices that are typically paid at the settlement?
Well, I may need better examples of that, which we could probably take offline, but my point about the transaction coordinator or admin is that's usually someone that's part of a team or hired by an agent to help facilitate their paperwork. That's someone who's included as part of the work as the listing agent. That's not someone that the seller has hired separately, like an attorney or someone like that, if that makes sense. The seller can still, if seller has invoices, construction invoices and other things that have to be paid at closing, they can still do that because they hired those people. Does that make sense?
Yes. Can the agent not pay that transaction coordinator from their part of the income they're receiving from the seller?
I can't speak for other states, but in New Jersey, it would be the requirement of the agent to pay them directly, unless they are licensed with eXp Realty in New Jersey, then the brokerage has to pay it out of the commission.
Okay, so if it is a licensed admin, transaction coordinator, anything, then that is okay. And that's a per state thing, or is it everywhere?
It depends on the compensation rules in each state.
Okay, thank you.
Jeffrey, Emma had asked or mentioned, I thought eXp Realty is the only brokerage not doing broker-to-broker compensation. And then after that said, this is not a state law.
So to answer that, it is not a state law. State law still allows broker-to-broker compensation. And as a matter of fact, in our seller agency disclosure that we need to use now, and in every one of the MLS listing agreements, there is verbiage in there about brokers sharing commissions. And it's always been there, whether you've noticed it or not, but it's always been there. And it still needs to be there because it's still permitted in state law. I hope it goes away because really don't need it. But anyway, eXp Realty is not the only brokerage who is not doing broker-to-broker compensation. In fact, if you listen to the interview that I mentioned this morning, or just mentioned earlier, which we did a replay at our training class this morning, every broker that was on there indicated that they are not, I think everyone, there could have been one that said otherwise, that they're not participating in broker-to-broker compensation.
Yeah, and this is, I heard Leo say too, that is the commission sharing is the crux of the NAR settlement.
Right.
So although, and again, guys, we've done so many transactions post August 1st in New Jersey already that all are 100% compliant, with neither the buyer or the seller really caring that we had to move the way things are done slightly to still have a very similar effect to what is mentioned there. But we are 100% compliant. So why not do business that way and not be at risk with NAR, despite what a state law may allow, which, to your point, Jeffrey, probably won't be allowed shortly. They're just, a lot of states are playing catch up with NAR. I think California's made some pretty good changes as a state quickly.
I just put the YouTube video in the chat too, that Jeffrey mentioned a few times, because I listened to about 2/3 of it this morning, and it was very informative. Anthony Lamacchia is on there, took the same position, no commission sharing. He came out quick and early. I believe Real Brokerage also made the same position in the last week or so. So to your point, it's ubiquitous. It's becoming ubiquitous, it seems, as a position a lot of people are taking.
And we've just been really the vocal one about it. And you know, as they said in that video, you know, that other brokers reached out to them or came up to them and said, you know, we're doing exactly the same thing. You just have the bigger mouth, right? And so there's a lot of brokerages that have taken that stance because of the guidance from the Department of Justice.
Awesome. And MS, do we foresee this eventually becoming a state law? I think there is some thoughts out there that the DOJ can make this into law at some point, which is kind of why people are getting out in front of it. And a couple things like that is one, and the other is taking the seller concession field or the seller commission paying direct to the buyer agent off the listing agreement. Both are not state law, both are not national law, but both are probably coming down the pipe with the angle of the way the DOJ and the industry is going. So this is kind of a lot of people getting proactive, us being one of them for that as well. There's a question in the chat about open houses. I know we got about 15, 20 minutes left here. I thought maybe that'd be a good place to spend some time. Jeffrey, if you mind giving us all some guidance on exactly the best practices there, especially within a team structure. A lot of people here within a team structure as well. I know there's been new forms that go up, just some of the conversations, I think, you know, the nuances of how to talk to people and how to engage with them and then lead them to this discussion in the right way. Might be helpful if you can shed some light.
Sure. So ironically, in the New Jersey law, it specifically says, well, we're now required to display a sign, and the sign does not have to be a giant, you know, billboard. It just needs to be, we created a landscape 8.5 by 11 version. It just needs to sit next to the sign-in sheet, right? That's all that needs to be done. Doesn't need to be on the door. It doesn't need to be just right next to the sign-in sheet. That's all it needs to be. New Jersey Realtors created their version of it. I don't love it. So if you are an eXp Realty agent in New Jersey, use ours, please, and you will find it through all the regular resources that we have. By default, we are a seller's agent for a seller. So that means that's blanket agency, which means that everyone at eXp Realty in New Jersey represents that seller, which means everyone who, you know, anyone can host that open house. And when they are hosting that open house, the sign gives notice to prospective buyers that the host of the open house is representing the seller only. Now, we've, you know, basically that sign says they're representing the seller only. You know, don't tell them anything that you don't want them to tell the seller. That's basically what that sign says, except it's like, you know, 7 paragraphs long. Ironically, we've always had to do that. That's the consumer information statement, right? So when we met prospective buyers at open houses, we always had to explain that we were a seller's agent. We always had to explain those relationships. I've attended enough open houses, I'm going to say, of other brokerages, where they don't explain that. And so now, you know, the New Jersey has basically said, well, here's how we're going to make sure that happens. So now we have to display a sign. And the sign-in sheet, which we also we updated our version in our Google Drive folder. There's a spot now to indicate whether you are being represented, or specifically whether you've signed a broker. I believe it says brokerage agreement. Okay, so buyers and tenants are now required to inform you if they have already entered into an agreement with another brokerage. Okay, and if they have, great, put that information in, there so we can follow up with your agent. If not, then we can offer our services as an agent if they want. But yes, any members of the team can host the open house, unless we are specifically working as a designated agent, which we shouldn't be. But if we're specifically working as a designated agent at the start of the listing, then only the agent who's the designated agent can host the open house and have anything to do with the seller.
Perfect. And I love this is another kind of opportunity, I think, where things weren't being done because other people weren't doing them, and the industry incorrectly reverted to the easier way and not having these conversations.
Right.
But now with this paperwork here, not unlike the buyer agency agreements, that we can now level the playing field and not have to worry about no one else doing them, giving us a disadvantage. This gives us an advantage to start that conversation with the open house guest, where it used to not even be something that would have to come up if you didn't bring it up properly, right? If you've kind of were doing the same mistake everyone was doing. Now it's right there, it's on the table, and it needs to be discussed. And it gives you the opportunity to essentially interview for the job and have the discussion about talking about a longer term agreement, how you work with your clients, how, where they're at in their search, how your value and your services can meet them where they're at and be able to really be a service to them and going forward. So it's another, flipping it on its head a little bit, where everyone's kind of upset about a lot of changes. There's some opportunity inside the changes, very strategic ones, if we look at them properly and execute.
Well, I think too, the opportunity here is massive, because a lot of agents, I'm pretty sure every single person on this call has probably had some quote unquote clients or leads that have given them the runarounds on showings and whatever else without any sort of commitment. Andrew, I don't know if you're still on this call or can unmute and just talk about what the text that you and I were chatting about yesterday of a client that requested a showing, and then Andrew had reached out to him to chat about the new changes and them needing to have a buyer broker agreement signed or even a single property agreement signed. And the response was that he wasn't able to commit to Andrew because he had another agent that he was working with in another area. So that alone right there is a massive, what's the word I'm looking for? What's that?
Time saver. You saved
yeah, massive time saver here, because Andrew would have probably gotten in his car or whenever it is, scheduled the showing. It was probably 45 minutes away, 45 minutes back, maybe 30 minutes there. So Andrew just saved himself 2 hours out of his day for someone that would have potentially been a tire kicker. But now, the way you flip this, and we talked about this stuff on our first call, and I see a lot of new faces on this call. The beauty of this entire change is now you have people that are signed with you that have agreed to work with you. So it's time for you to put on your work hat and go work for them and find them some opportunities that may not exist on the MLS. It may not exist on the open market. So Kevin, for example, I'll use the same Kevin as Andrew's brother, but
I can jump in real quick too. Actually, that guy got back to me. His agent didn't even tell him about the whole new laws. So he's actually leaning towards using me now because I told him all about this. So there's definitely
that's the thing, Andrew, you were prepped in this in this change, which a lot of agents, from what I'm noticing with my interactions with them, is they've kind of just brushed this underneath the rug as it's not here, right? Jamie, you had mentioned to me you had another agent that you were talking, Jim Meringue, you were talking with earlier in the week, and he's like, I don't care to get these signed. Well, we do need to get them signed. And I think the conversation is pretty simple with the client is if that agent is willing to do this without getting you on an agreement that is required by law now, right? And doing these things, what else are they going to be hiding from you throughout the transaction? That's the only thing that you need to say, and mic drop and you're done.
Yeah, and don't forget that if you are not getting the buyer agreement signed and you start working with a buyer, you potentially jeopardize your license too. So you got to be very, very careful with that, you know. And I just wanted to mention about that other agreement where the buyer had an agreement for another area. It is possible for a buyer to have multiple agreements with different brokers as long as they are for different areas, right? So they could be working with one agent in South Jersey, they could be working with a different agent in North Jersey. So it is okay to do that. But you know, just make sure that they understand and very clear. And if a buyer does want to start working with a different agent, they can, but they do need to terminate in writing the existing agreement first before they enter into a new agreement with another buyer's agent.
Jeff, can you talk a little
Well,
bit more about that? Because I know that's been a question that's come up a few times. Because I know in the buyer broker agreement, there's a clause that says, I don't remember the exact verbiage, I can pull it up, but it does say in there that you're able to cancel.
Yeah, so it depends on it depends on which agreement is being used, but there is verbiage in both that there's the opportunity to cancel. There's a certain amount of notice that needs to be given, which is either written in and agreed to with both parties, or there's an automatic fill-in in there. And the buyer, our requirement to the buyer is to provide them with a list of properties we've shown to them and worked with them on. And here's a big distinguishing factor. Sending buyers listings from an MLS or from your website, that's not considered working for the buyer, right? So properties that that you've spent time to introduce and show, you have to compile a list for that buyer and say, this is the list of properties that we've worked on together up to this point. If you buy these properties within a certain period of time, compensation is still owed to us per our agreement.
And is EXP, so just question, like, does the blanket buyer agreement have more weight than the individual property one? I was thinking, like, if I have a buyer, they sign to be I'm their agent for the next 6 months. And they happen to go to an open house. By chance, they sign a single property agreement with the agent that's showing the open house. And they make an offer on that through that agent. Like, are we going to see through that lawsuit? Or is my agreement going to have more weight than that single property agreement?
That's going to depend on the circumstances. If you had nothing to do with introducing that property, then you may not be entitled to compensation if it was that agent who helped them discover the property and helped show them and get them to the point, like procuring cause, get them to the point of putting in an offer. One of the best things that we can do, and again, going on my 8th year, so kind of repeating myself, but one of the best things that we can do for buyers is educate them. And buyer consultations are going to be essential in your regular practice. And part of that consultation is making sure the buyer knows you are their only contact. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the story of I've been working with this buyer, but they went on this website, clicked for information, requested a showing, another agent showed it to them, and now they're submitting an offer with that agent. And, and it's like, well, but that's because, but you didn't have anything to do with that property. And so the problem is you didn't educate them to not click buttons on websites, right? So the idea is to make sure they know if they see a property online, because we're not going to end up showing them or introducing every single property that they have an interest in. We know for a fact they're going to go online. I mean, the first thing that you can do is make sure you have you know, an IDX fed website so that your website has all of the properties that they might be interested in, right? So you want to make sure that you keep them on your website. But if they stray and go to others, you have to train them. Do not click anything. If you click something, if you request a showing, you're going to get connected with an agent just like me. And then they're going to end up being your agent for that property because, you know, you didn't come through me. If you see it for sale by owner, if you see anything anywhere, anything to do with real estate, don't do anything before you talk to me.
So that our blanket agreement won't carry weight. In the instance that I have an agreement signed with them, they're driving home, they see an open house sign, they go into that open house, they sign a property agreement with that agent. I can't say, hey, EXP, I want to sue this agent or this buyer.
Oh, you can absolutely say that. Would you win? That would be up to a judge. My guess would be, I'm not sure about that because we didn't introduce the property to them, but it all depends on the circumstances.
Do you think that individual property one holds more weight then? Just because it's like, hey, like we're talking about, no?
No, I don't think it holds more weight. I think of the two agreements, a longer term buyer broker agreement definitely holds more weight if you are introducing those two agreements. So my advice to you would be you give them the longer form, right? Not the single property. So in that instance, yes, it definitely holds more weight, but it does not always hold more weight if there was another agreement that, you know, had to do with a property that you had nothing to do with, right? So again, it's really going to be on a case-by-case basis. So if that were to happen, we would look at it. But the best thing we can do is make sure we educate them right now, and keep this in mind too. Buyers have to, when they go to an open house, indicate if they have entered into a brokerage agreement. So one of the things that you need to do is remind them that and prepare them to go to open houses. Send them to open houses. That's not a problem. But educate them. Make sure they know what they have to do when they get there.
I think that's an incredibly important point to drive home. And I think also, especially in our market in Hudson County, it's so segmented that a lot of buyers will think you only cover specific towns or cities. And we've lost, unfortunately, you know, I see Jeff here on here and Mike Hearn was on before. Like we've lost people up to his market that's like 2 miles over because they thought we were Hoboken and Jersey City only. And it was just never discussed. So I think I caution people to make sure if you're good and competent and can service people in those areas, even if they say, I'm only looking in this area right now, dig deep, like really do the buyer consultation the right way, understand their needs, even say, I would never consider that area. But what's important about what you're looking for? And maybe that area does service that. They just are unaware of it, right? So it really makes us do our job even better to protect ourselves in that kind of situation. There's going to be bad actors. I think that's where Jeff's answer is like, it depends, because if it's a bad actor, and I've had situations where listing agents have tried to twist someone's arm into making an offer through them, even though I have a 6-month, year-long, 2-year-long relationship, and they get pressured and they're scared, and then they do it. And a couple of times they've fallen apart, and those are my best clients long-term. They've come back, they felt so guilty about it, and the other agents are just bad actors. I think there, if I'm not mistaken, we might have a case. We might have some arbitration. We might have something. But if it's us dropping the ball, even though we have a buyer's agency agreement and they're like, I haven't heard from Jeff in a month, and then I went into this open house, we don't have a paper trail of communication, you know, let alone introducing that property. And it's not the other person being a bad actor as much. So I think that's how I at least kind of foresee it unfolding.
Yep.
As well. Cool. All right, guys, we got about 9 minutes left. Jeff, we can't thank you enough for taking this time on Thursday. I know you're a busy guy. Got a lot of people you're managing, helping, overseeing, navigating things with. So any last questions, guys? Anything that didn't get answered that someone really wanted to bring up and have a discussion around in the last few minutes here?
Are you open to us starting a petition to leave NAR?
Am I personally?
Yeah.
No.
Eric Eckhart hates that we have 13 MLSs in New Jersey and NAR, and yeah,
Why
don't
would you say
govern Eric
they're as
Eckhart.
powerful as we say they are, they would have at least fought back more on this case, or maybe even won it. But that's just my opinion.
Well, I'm glad to speak to that just briefly. The NAR settlement is not an admission of guilt. The NAR settlement is saving money. NAR would absolutely go bankrupt completely if they had to fight this case. I think it was a bad decision for sure, but they don't have the resources to do it. And the best part about the settlement is that it protects us. If they were to go and win that settlement or win that case on appeal, there's still the opportunity for other cases. Part of this settlement actually protects us in the future. So there's no more cases around this. And that's a really, really important piece to remember. And so I was not happy about it either. But as soon as that was explained to me and I realized that, it makes a whole lot of sense. It really does.
Yeah. I think Leo said
we couldn't have done it without them.
Yeah. Leo said even like one level above that, like he said a great analogy the other day. He's like, I got my license, I'm driving along, I'm following all the rules, and all of a sudden 5 years later, someone came and told me I've been breaking the rules for the last 5 years and I had to pay a fine for it. And I feel that way too. But I also know like this industry is going to get professionalized. Opportunity comes from change. There's going to be less agents standing in a year, 2 years from now. And everyone who's here instead of at the beach right now is going to be making more money, serving more clients, and doing better, in my opinion. So I'm like, let's make lemonade out of lemons, or whatever the heck the saying is. I don't like it. I don't like how we got here. I think it's ridiculous that a courtroom in Missouri they got to dictate policy across the whole country. But you know what? I'm finding some opportunity spots inside of here, and we're gonna take market share and kick some butt.
Yeah, Jeff, we really appreciate you coming on. And like Jeff mentioned too, I love that everybody has to get them signed. It's an even playing field. And at the end of the day, I think it's going to be a good thing for real estate agents within the industry, not only protecting themselves, protecting their clients, but also protecting their time and working efficiently on agreements that stand by whatever their values may be in regards to, setting commissions and whatnot. So got a few more minutes. Any other questions, guys, before we wrap up? If not, we'll shut it down. Eric Eckhart, no more MLS or NAR. Go turn on your Rage Against the Machine and get out of the office. Yeah.
We'll have the recording circulated to everybody, I believe, and invite to the next one in 2 weeks. Mr. Kist won't be joining us in that one. We can't take him every 2 weeks for 90 minutes. We'll be talking about some other topics. We're going to keep, things are going to change. Things are going to evolve. Strategies that we need to do to win. This was more of a legalese, broker-centric kind of conversation today. But 2 weeks ago, it was more like, what are we doing? How do we navigate? How do we prospect properly? How do we make sure our mindsets are right? We're going to get back to some more of those conversations in 2 weeks, and just keep these running as long as, they're beneficial and people are showing up for them to really help elevate, professionalize, and make the industry better long-term. So you guys sign us off and, rock and roll.
Perhaps we can start going into the new consultations and some of the different ways in which we're having the conversations and setting the expectations and actually making our agent experience easier with the higher level of expectation and a faster path to getting buyers what they want through the conversation in the consultation. Wouldn't that be fun?
Love it. I hear there's big things coming on that horizon out of line. So exciting stuff.
Talk to you guys soon.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks again, Jeffrey. Appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody.